the industrial, technological competition, sort of the capabilities themselves. China is investing heavily in a carrier strike capability. Do you know much of the Chinese plan? Are they intending to match the US in having 10 fleet carriers versus the US's 10, or what's the plan there?
Yeah, so I think the Chinese have been quite cautious and incremental in how they've approached their carrier program, partially reflecting the inherent complexity of aircraft carriers as well as the enabling capabilities that make them useful in the first place, but partially because they recognize that their immediate goals are in the first island chain in the Indo-Pacific, and that to some extent attenuates the requirement for carriers. That being said, there are two sets of objectives, well, three really, that really incentivize the adoption of aircraft carriers for the Chinese. The first is actually within the first island chain. We're actually looking at quite a substantial area of space, right? The South China Sea is analogous in size to the Mediterranean. The nearest Chinese air bases are 1,200 kilometers away. So in many ways, power projection in China's region has an almost expeditionary quality given the sheer scale of that region. The second aim for which aircraft carriers are quite useful for the Chinese is what their military theorists call forward edge defense. So it's the idea that, in the event of a local crisis in the Indo-Pacific, it is attendant on the PLA to slow down the deployment of the US capabilities to the immediate environs of the first island chain. And obviously, anti-access capabilities like the DF-21D might be one way of achieving that, but a carrier strike group that is beyond the first island chain will inevitably tie up in the early days of a crisis or a conflict a number of American assets to track or engage this. And this has a disruptive knock-on effect on all American plans to deploy to the first island chain. So paradoxically, the carriers in this context are a sort of fleet in being for the more sort of locally oriented force of green water vessels and ground-based aircraft and everything else that supports Chinese objectives in the first island chain. And then the final sort of reason they might pursue carriers, of course, is the Indian Ocean, because their sea lines of communication are straddled by, choke points like Malacca, which has traditionally been a concern for the Chinese. And overcoming this dilemma is something they can achieve with a degree of local preponderance, certainly potentially vis-a-vis the Indian Navy in the foreseeable future, but perhaps in due course they would aspire to doing so vis-a-vis the US Navy as well. The approach in programmatic terms has been quite cautious. So they bought essentially an old Soviet light carrier from the Ukrainians in the mid-2000s, refurbished it, and of course it became the Looming, the Type 001, China's first carrier. Now, this was not necessarily treated as a critical combat capability, but it was very useful for training the first generation of PLA naval aviators. With China's first Katobar-equipped carrier, which has reached initial operational capability this year, however, the Fujian, what we're seeing is the gradual evolution towards a full-scale carrier strike capability. In tactical terms, I think the Chinese view carriers slightly differently than we do in one respect, which is that the carrier is the centerpiece of a much larger group of surface escorts that would normally accompany a Western carrier, including 1 to 2 Type 55 cruisers, as well as 1 to 2 Type 52 destroyers, and then several sort of frigates. And the vertical launch cell capacity and the anti-ship cruise missile capacity on these cruisers and destroyers generally exceeds that of an Arleigh Burke or a Ticonderoga class. So in some ways, the carrier might act as fleet air protection for a very VLS-centric sort of surface fleet, rather than the way we think about it, which is the other way around. The surface escorts protect the carrier. So there's a slight difference in perhaps the tactical modalities there, which is worth examining. But broadly speaking, I think the strategic function it plays for the Chinese is similar. In terms of where they might go, in terms of to your question about numbers, I think the aspiration they've laid out is to have 6 carrier battle groups over the course of time, which is comparable to, though not equal to, the United States. The challenges they're going to face, though, is there are still certain technological bottlenecks facing them. So, scaling the production of WS-19 turbofan engines for their next generation of carrier-borne aircraft is something they're still struggling to do. They also haven't yet fielded a credible airborne early warning capability for the Catabar-equipped carriers. And anti-submarine warfare is at reach, is still an area where they struggle. So I think building the institutional capacity to support a large number of carrier strike groups in a way that makes them combat credible is still something they are working around. And I think they, to some degree, recognize this, which is why there's been quite an ambitious but nonetheless very incremental approach to building a carrier strike capability.
Really interesting to hear a theme that I know has been emerging in the land domain, that the kind of the fighting arms, the infantry and the cavalry are there to protect the specialists. That that in modern warfare, that's the sort of incredible to see that inversion in the maritime domain too, Jerry. That you, as the carrier, the captain of the fleet's flagship, are there to defend your destroyer captains. But I see a lot of logic in what was said there. That the real battle is these long range, hypersonic precision fires, and that actually being able to control the sea space within which those cruisers and destroyers that have that capability embarked is a really important maritime naval function. Do you subscribe to that vision of the future of the naval battle? Because if so, you can see how the shape of navies changes quite quickly as a consequence.
Yes, I agree. I mean, let's go back 100 years to the genesis of the aircraft carrier in the round. People may notice that the pennant number of all Royal Naval aircraft carriers start with the letter R. And people say, well, shouldn't it be C for carrier? Well, no, we have C for cruisers, but D for destroyers, F for frigates. And aircraft carriers were R because it meant reconnaissance. They were just there to provide aircraft to go up threat and spot the enemy, to allow battleships to fire their big guns, their 15 and 16-inch guns against the enemy. So the aircraft carriers were literally an ISR platform, if you like, to spot the enemy. And then, of course, they become much more central as a strike asset in their own right, based on aircraft and the missiles that aircraft carry. So I do subscribe that the evolution of the carrier may well go back a bit, and where the carrier becomes this sort of, if you like, this protective base from which to allow other ships to launch missiles and whatever they're carrying. But I do think that's a bit simplistic. I think the advent of drones and robotics, I foresee in the next 20 or 30 years, particularly Iran, definitely China, and maybe other countries developing quite quickly robotic air wings, which we've talked about for a long time. Doctrinally, the West, the Americans, the British, have always seen manned fixed-wing aircraft as the sort of the centrality of an aircraft carrier air wing. That's going to shift, in my view, very quickly. And I think absolutely, ultimately, we may get a robotic aircraft carrier, a big deck floating with very few humans on it, but able to call drones forward to provide an envelope around the fleet that's moving several hundred miles a day. So we will see. But I know that whatever happens, the aircraft carrier or air system carrier will be around for a long time yet.